everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History and the Arts and Culture team BPL Presents. This year, Brooklyn Public Library celebrates its 125th anniversary. And our birthday provides an opportunity to recognize all that the library does. And one very important part of that work is stewarding the extraordinary special collections at the Center for Brooklyn History. These archives are the combined materials that come from Brooklyn Public Library and the former Brooklyn Historical Society, and combined, they are literally, truly the most comprehensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. 1,600 collections, 33,000 books, 1,200 oral histories, 50,000 photographs, 2,000 maps, and on and on. So we're celebrating our amazing collections in a 125th anniversary series titled Out of the Box. And Out of the Box puts a selection of these materials center stage in conversations with guests who share stories and insights revealed in these sometimes very humble and sometimes truly spectacular items. So Out of the Box is a 5-part series, and you can learn about all of the programs by going to the link in the chat. But I'm going to get straight to tonight's conversation because tonight we're really looking at a very special collection, the papers of Pete Hamill. We are joined by two people who knew Pete and loved Pete and worked with him intimately: his brother, the journalist, novelist, and screenwriter Denis Hamill, and his longtime editor, Bill Phillips, who worked with Pete on 8 of his books, all published by Little Brown, including the classic novels Snow in August and Forever. We're going to start with a brief overview of the collections presented by the lucky person who had the privilege of processing these papers, Center for Brooklyn History archivist Sarah Quick. Before handing it off to Sarah, I have 2 very quick notes for you. Number 1, you have the option to use closed captioning tonight. Just click the CC, the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And second, most important, I want to invite you to share your questions tonight. To do that, use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my great pleasure to invite Sarah to come on the screen and turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. So my name is Sarah Quick. I'm the archivist here at the Center for Brooklyn History, and I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about the process of processing the Pete Hamill papers. I've also selected 3 items from the collection that I'll say just a few words about. So processing an archival collection is really the act of establishing control of the collection through arrangement and description. So this means basic preservation and conservation steps, rearranging if necessary, and writing a comprehensive collection guide. So basically taking a box of stuff and making it an organized, discoverable collection. But of course, in Pete's case, it was way more than just stuff. The collection came to the library in 2021 as a donation from Pete's wife, Akiko. And one of the really exciting aspects of this collection is that it has what we call original order. So in this case, both the order of the folders and the folder titles reflect Pete's own record-keeping system. And this adds a ton of value. So we're not just getting information from the items in the collection, but the arrangement itself tells us a little bit about how Pete's brain worked. So the items in this collection are mostly from when Pete left full-time newspaper work. What we have here is materials concerning his novels, speeches, and appearances. And we also have what we call his subject files, which is an A to Z file structure that includes everything from correspondence, travel plans, research, information about awards he received, freelance articles, and much more. It's basically a hodgepodge of subjects covering his professional and personal life. So the first item I wanted to show was the speech. And to me, one of the most interesting items in the series, one of the most interesting series in the collection is speeches, the bulk of which date from about 2004 to 2011. He did a lot of public speaking on various topics, and since the majority of them were not recorded, these note cards, the only things that we have left of what was such a big part of his post-newspaper career. He talks about his family, his life growing up in Brooklyn, the Irish immigrant experience, which of course was a constant theme in his work, and a lot of the projects that he's working on. You just really get a sense of his personality and his energy from these cards. So this example is from a speech he gave while accepting his honorary diploma at Regis. And I've only included one page, but even this one page like tells an entire story. Next slide, please. So in the writing series, oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Next one. Oh, sorry, I guess you guys didn't get to read that one, but it's all right. So the writing series is divided into 3 sub-series, which is scripts and treatments, books and articles, and writing by others. So included in this series is extensive research for a novel, which to my knowledge was never published, which Pete called the Belfast novel or Billy Dillon. And it was loosely based on the life of his father. And Pete was in contact with, I think, either a friend or relative in Belfast to help with research, fact checking, and to provide some context. So what I have here are notes from this contact, and it includes some information about Pete's father, general notes about Belfast and the people of North Ireland, and some what I can only assume was unsolicited advice. I'm like, what about atmosphere? Like a good painting, can you do that? Yes, of course. I find your writing good, clear, and informative, but a bit stiffly journalistic. Loosen up. Okay. But, you know, according to number 8, the people of North Ireland know better. So who am I to say? Next slide, please. And hopefully this doesn't feel too morbid, but Pete contributed the foreword for this. And it was a year in which, unfortunately, many of his friends were included. And I wanted to finish out my portion of tonight's program by reading a short passage from this foreword. That is, they chose people whose lives have helped shape the tale of their times. These men and women come from various small worlds within the larger society: art, politics, government, the law, sports, crime, science, media, movies, theater, music. If most eras are remembered as highlight films, with certain politicians and generals hogging center stage, others add the soundtrack or create the entertainment that become part of collective memory or push the boundaries of science, knowledge, literature, and art. The individual stories are always part of a larger tale. And with that, I'll hand it back to Marcia.
Sarah, thank you so much. I want to also echo Sarah's thanking of Pete's widow, Fukiko Hamill, for donating these spectacular papers. She told me at one point during the planning of this program that she wanted the papers to be in Brooklyn where they belong, which I think is beautiful. So now I want to bring on our 2 guests. Of many decades, come on the screen and welcome. And thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Excited to talk to you. You know, I'm going to dig in a little bit, and I've pulled, I've had an extraordinary experience going through these meticulous collections, which are so easy to get lost in and so revealing of who the man was and what he cared about and how his creative process played out. And so what I want to do is look at a couple of examples. I'm going to share my screen and then come back and talk a little bit about what your reactions are to those and what they say to you about Pete. So here I go. Okay, so as Sarah said, Pete wrote many speeches and he put them on these index cards. And as I went through them, so many of them circled back to those formative years, Dennis, when you were growing up. So this is one from I want to show you guys two. This is one from the Princeton Club. His notes say hard times, that things worse than poverty. One who was part of last generation of New York white people to grow up poor. And he says he was born in 1935, 10, when the war ended, depression didn't end for another 5, 6 years. I'm having a hard time seeing what's at the bottom there. Here we go. And then he writes, fought it, in a separate note. And
Yeah.
And then
Pete's line about that growing up poor in that neighborhood was that we were poor, but we certainly were not impoverished. And I think it's because he really thought that family love really enriched all of our lives. That's really what. And it was a neighborhood that Pete said that where the depression really didn't leave until the early 60s. It kind of when John F. Kennedy was elected. I think it was Jimmy Cannon who was one of Pete's mentors. Jimmy Cannon said that it was when Kennedy got elected that we all stopped becoming mixed. We were no longer called mixed, and it was that kind of a neighborhood. So I think that's what Pete was referring to there.
Yeah, he was. He said exactly what he says in the card here. But although
Right.
we're not impoverished, somehow we got along. I love this. Without TV, telephones, cell phones, video games, without iPods, laptops. He inserts email or Google. We lived in a republic of words. Words on the radio, words in newspapers, on comics, words in books. We listened to these words spoken by faceless human beings, FDR, Murrow, and the Dodgers.
Yeah.
And he says a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit, show you this other speech, which is about North River. And then we can go back on screen, the three of us, two themes. The one I want to focus on is honor the generation that made my own life possible. I did not grow up on the west side of Manhattan, not West Village or Hell's Kitchen. I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood of Brooklyn. Tenements, cold water flats, immigrants and their children, Irish, Italian, Eastern European Jews. I went to a Catholic school. I was a Shabbos goy. Who knew, really? And I discovered the joy of cooking when Mrs. Caputo came across the hall.
Yeah, with the rigatoni.
So tell me about growing up and as the Hamill family on 7th Avenue and Park Slope.
I also remember Mrs. Caputo coming across the hall with the Italian. She taught my mother how to make a sauce, and it changed our lives. Pete always said the one thing about St. Patrick, he was a Roman slave, but why the hell couldn't he have brought at least one recipe with him to Ireland, But it was an amazing neighborhood in a way because it was filled with characters, very colorful characters. My old man met a lot of them in the saloons, and then Pete would meet them, and there were gangs in the neighborhood. And Pete, Pete grew up around all of that, and so did I, and in a different generation. And you just fed on all of that. For a writer, it was a treasure chest because the way people spoke, the way they scratched out a living, where people hardly ever complained. They had very little, but they loved a lot, and they partied a lot. I remember a neighborhood where everybody, because there was no air conditioning in the summer months, everybody would come down with folding chairs or sit on milk boxes on the avenue and wait for the Daily News and the Mirror to come up, and everybody would sit around with transistor radios listening to night games, the Dodgers and the Yankees or the Mets later on. And so that there was not a lot of street crime because of that Jane Jacobs way of density making for a safer city. There were too many eyes on the street for there to be any real trouble. People trusted each other to watch out for each other's kids. It was a neighborhood which is defined as a brotherhood of neighbors. So people really got along and loved each other. You know, people hung their wash from the back windows of tenements. Pigeons flew from coops on the roof. People hung out on stoops. There were bonfires on election night. And that grew out of a tradition where Brooklyn, when it was its own city, that where they lit the bonfires to let the city fathers across the river know that Brooklyn had voted. So, and you could vote, 2 or 3 times. You could vote from Greenwood Cemetery in those days. So, so Pete had that kind of richness growing up. When he said he wasn't impoverished, look at what he had to draw from to write about: the working man, the blue collar immigrant. They were the city of New York. The city really laid in the outer boroughs. If Manhattan, Pete once described it to me the way the custom motto of the fight trainer said, if you kill the body, the head dies. Manhattan was the head and the boroughs were the body. And so if anything bad happened to Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, Manhattan would collapse. So you had to pay attention to the working people. And that's what he brought with him to the New York Post as a columnist. It's also what he wrote about. And you were surprised that he was a Shabbos Goy, but that was the character he was in Snow in August. He took his real life experience as a kid who was an altar boy. The rabbi went and got an altar boy to become the Shabbos Goy. And Pete, had a love of comic books. And so the golem became to him like a comic book hero. And it had the same phantasmagoric allure to him. So he took his real life stuff as a Shabbos Goy and melded it into the traditions of Judaism that he learned from this old rabbi. And he learned so much about the Jewish life from this guy that it wound up being a novel all these years later. That's how Pete worked.
You both Bill and you, Dennis, have talked to me about how his journalistic career informed his novels. And I want to share my screen again and show you another speech because I thought it was fantastic. Let me just get there. So he wrote a speech called "The Unshaky State of Newspapers." And he describes his own experience in the newspaper world. 50 years ago, went to work as an apprentice reporter, Post. Knew nothing, no J school, no high school, a world of people who loved and honored their craft. They could be cranky, they had bad habits, most snored at their desks, put cigs out on the floor, some of their personal lives a mess. There were more laughs than anyone ever deserved. And then he writes, summer in the city room, mosquitoes, slapping, a sense of pity from others, taught me the fundamentals. And he writes about PM paper, time to hurry out into the night to a fire or a murder, time to return and write against the 8 a.m. deadline, the first byline, the first press card. I was never happier.
Yeah.
Go
ahead. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say that it's interesting that these, at least in my experience with Pete, with 4 novels, 2 of which we've been talking about, that Snow in August is such a, as you confirmed, Dennis, such a, even though it's not truly autobiographical, it evokes the whole world that obviously didn't exist anymore when he was writing, and that he was able to transmit this into believable fiction without all of the other stuff hanging on the edge was remarkable to me. But Tabloid City is the other story. It's the story of the collapse of newspapers. It's all that being a contemporary story, unlike Snow in August, essentially. And the hero is that kind of a guy. Briscoe, the newspaper editor, whose bosses are closing down his paper even as they talk. And it's like he had this ability to translate real life stuff into fiction without looking like he was doing it. You know, I mean, it was so artful and so clever that it was always very believable, as if it was created out of whole cloth, not just a lot of personal memories put into a book.
Right. He suspended disbelief. I mean, because he had the bedrock of experience. And the thing about Pete was that he took his own personal experiences and knew how to fictionalize them and to turn them into stories. And one of his real gifts was the art of the telling detail. You know, I mean, he took copious notes. He used those index cards, as you say, Marcia, but you know, he always carried them with him, and he would write them down if he got a simile that he liked, or a metaphor, or an idea for a story, or a snippet of dialogue he heard, whether it was in a bar or a restaurant or at a Met game or wherever he was. Pete always had a pen and something to write with. But his advice to all young writers was, as soon as you get home from covering whatever it is, empty your notebook, sit down in a chair, put your ass in a chair, and sit at the keyboard. He called it the typewriter because that's what he used in the beginning. All of us did. And type it out, because that's the second draft of your notes. And then it becomes vivid in your head. You don't forget, because we all forget things. Pete wanted to remember them all. And memory was very, very important to him, because he did feel like, I don't know if you did Drinking Life. Did you do a
Yeah, oh yeah.
And so he spent a lot of time trying to remember details. He would check with my sister Kathleen, who was the archivist of the family. He keeps all the calendar dates and the relatives and the photographs. But he would call up and check on the family stuff. And then he would listen to music to evoke memories, because he knew that when he went out with a certain girl when he was 17, he remembered a jukebox in a saloon where he would fake ID, where he was having a beer, and it would all come back to him. And so the details of being a reporter, he learned the importance of details from being a reporter. But those same details in fiction make it really believable. I think that's what he brought. That's what he translated.
He used to, he would, I guess I was a good sounding board for him, or at least just somebody who was paid to listen to him, which was always a delight. But he would send me little notes like the kind you're talking about,
right.
In which he described a little of experience that he had, and would say, I'm thinking of working this into something, or when he was working on Drinking Life, which was nonfiction, but definitely Snow in August, and definitely North River, which were all sort of set in earlier times as opposed to Tabloid City. But all of those kinds of little things that just percolated. And it seemed to me that he was so incredibly organized.
He really was.
And I was looking through some of the stuff I have, which is just on my computer. I don't have the paper before we stopped using paper. And there are all these little tidbits that he would send along, almost as if I were to act as his memory for him to a certain extent. It was a fascinating process. It was just to watch. I hadn't had experience where I worked so closely with a writer before, as I did with Pete, and to see the development of it all, and sometimes the derailment when he would abandon a book and go on to a different book, because we had this phrase I was telling Marcia earlier, change in plans. Whenever he would send me a little message saying, there's been a change in plans, I would go, oh, what do we got here? And it often meant that he dropped a book. The first book that we did or signed up at Little Brown was something called, maybe you remember this, 1955, The Last Great Year. This was
No.
to be a book about 1955 in New York City. And I loved the idea because I was, I was a kid then and remembered that year very vividly.
Right.
We were both wrong, though, however, because it didn't work. It was too narrow.
But it was the year the Dodgers won, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's why.
And that also led to a drinking life, because that's what it morphed into after he gave that story up. And that's one of the great memoirs. And it was a big bestseller, so it was a big hit for him. And the process by which he didn't throw it away, he didn't get that upset about it, or at least to me, or at least, and he wasn't in despair or anything. He was just moving ahead with this very organized mind.
Yeah, he always said to me that it's a process.
Yeah.
And he didn't suffer about abandoning something. He would try something. I mean, I think, and that came also from newspapers, and what you described, that process of where he would send you notes and things like, well, that comes out of the newsroom. Because guys like Pete and Murray Kempton would often go around and say, what do you think this lead? What do you think it is? And then they would get approval from other reporters or sub-editors, and before you would go to the top editor. And then you would go back to you and start a new lead. Somebody say, no, you need to move stuff up a little higher. And then you would get a consensus in the newsroom, which is really missing from today's journalism, by the way, because there's not as much. And because everybody's home on Zooms. Or modeming it in, they're not typing in the newsroom. And I think he got that sounding board thing to try to see, does it play? Does it work? When something wasn't working for him, then I don't think he would stay with something he didn't have passion for.
No, that's true. I just was making some notes on that a little bit earlier, just trying to track it all. I said that, the last great year idea, that morphed into a drinking life. Then he was under contract for a novel. I don't remember anything about it, and I don't have any paper on it, but that changed into Snow in August. And then the other two novels that I worked with him on, the Forever the Forever, North River, and Tabloid City, they all went through this enormous process of change in what he would do with them, so that when Forever started out as a first-person novel, in the present story, as maybe listeners have read it, no, it's a story of a man who's granted immortality and lives over 200 years, most of them in the city of New York. Or
Manhattan Island, right? So
Manhattan. Oh, if he left Manhattan, he would die. And it started out as his first-person narrative in the present tense, in the present time, with these flashbacks to the past, and it ended up totally reversed as a third person novel.
I'm excited to jump in here, because actually this conversation about process, the collections show so much in an intimate way about Pete's process. And I'm going to share my screen again, because I just pulled a few nuggets that I love about his process writing Snow in August. Let me.
Good, you have more than I have. That would be great.
Ooh, hold on, I don't want to leave the meeting. I'm going to share. That would be okay. So here, this is fascinating. This is Snow in August. He's got 3 handwritten first sentences. Once upon a time before television invaded, right? Once upon a time in a hamlet wedged into the western slope of the borough of Brooklyn, a boy named Michael Devlin woke in the dark. And then once upon a time, before there was television and before there were computers and before children, and he goes on. And so these are handwritten notes. Here's another typed.
That's going.
This is a different, and at that point, Snow in August was titled The Shabbos Goy, and you can see he's writing it, he's marking it up. Now it starts on the Saturday morning after Christmas, the boy rose in the dark. I mean, I actually happen to have the book with me here. I can tell you that none of those are the first
none of
sentences
those
of
was
the
the
book.
first one. I'm trying to remember what was.
Sentences of the book.
But that
Now,
looks so much like every manuscript I ever sent him to read.
Yeah.
It would come back like that, looking like a blood clot. But go ahead.
that was his work, not mine.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
he had drawings. He drew out a map of the blocks represented in Snow in August. You can see, he shows you where the pool room is. He shows you where the house is. He shows you where the movie theater is and everything. And, and he was, of course, an artist. And then here's a notebook called Goy. I mean, that at some point he must have, used as a working title, Goy. This is from 1995. And you go inside and there's his meticulous, extraordinary handwriting. He's writing from the viewpoint, the voice of the rabbi. My father would take me down the street. He still calls and he goes on and on. But here you have a note again. These show so much about Pete's process. Snow in August, the rest of it,
Yeah.
And all these he numbers the things that he wants to make sure are ordered into the book.
Right.
The rabbi is beaten. Synagogue, the golem.
Right.
And more of a he's drawing now a little bit about what else is in the book, right? And so here we get into some of the questions about titles. So this is actually a fax, it looks like, from, or maybe it's an old email, I don't know, from you, Bill.
Right.
To
Right.
Pete. I'm going to read it. It says, Pete, people here, including Esther, are real uneasy using golem in the title. I'm afraid I agree. It's simply too exotic and off-putting. One title that's attracting a lot of support is Sticks and Stones.
Ugh.
What do you think? It certainly connects to the idea of the power of words, and there is a kind of sinister undertow that suggests breaking of limbs. Let me know, blah, blah, blah. Well, it didn't end up being that either. So what does Pete do? He writes a list of 20 titles.
Yeah.
He's got, and number 10 is Snow in August, right? But there's just 20 more,
It's Pete.
and at the top, his favorite is the Music of Angels, I guess, because that's what he was calling it then. Here we have a letter to you, Bill, from
Right.
Pete and Esquire Stationery. Now he's suggesting that the title be God Bless the Child, from the Billie Holiday story, or another possibility, Honor the Sabbath. He's just endless ideas. Here it is.
We couldn't get it right.
I remember the
happen to
magic
think
word.
Snow in August is a perfect title, and as just all the things it needed. But this was a torturous process for this particular book. So,
Yeah, because it was odd. Yeah, I mean, it was.
well, titles are always a big.
Yeah, very hard. Yeah.
And yet I don't think it's just hindsight. I think it's a perfect title for the book.
Yeah, so.
It has a certain hook, and anyway,
It's metaphorical too, in a way.
I want to ask you, Bill, a little bit about your working relationship.
Sure.
How your backs and forths.
Well, that's interesting. Some people you make a deal with, sign a contract, give them their money and they go away and write a book. And whether it's good or bad or not, you wait. That was never my relationship with Pete. It was probably all along the closest writer-editor relationship I had. I don't mean just because Pete was, as everybody who ever met him at any time, just a wonderful human being, but because we'd have this back and forth all the time, which was his way that he wanted to work with me. Because was my job to adapt to what the author wanted in this case. And I think it happened to be just a terrifically productive relationship. We just saw things the same way, or the things that, so we would go back and forth on everything. I went through, with him, a couple of drafts of, particularly with Forever, which was by far the most challenging and difficult book that we did together, because it was such a big story, and it just totally changed over two different drafts. And so it was a very close relationship editorially and personally, because it would always start out by him on the phone bitching about some politician or another. It was great to hear him do his rants.
But the thing was about, I can tell you what Pete thought of you. I mean, he trusted you, and that was a really big deal for Pete, because he took writing so seriously, and it wasn't just his career. He just believed he needed somebody, that every writer needed somebody. There was an old Daily News editor that once said that the Book of Kells can be edited, I mean, and so when he found someone that understood him and what he said made him better, he was happy to work with you all along, and then you became friends. So I mean, so it's about that relationship is about trust, and he really trusted you. I know that he did, because he spoke so highly of you all the time.
And I think you both also said to me, that there was a quality about Pete, that he wasn't defensive. He was really happy and wanting to take feedback.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
He wasn't one of these authors who, got prickly when someone didn't like a particular thing or didn't agree with a particular way.
And that came out of newspapers. I mean, because his
his
rabbi in newspapers was Paul Sand, who gave him his first job at the New York Post, and he trusted him because he took the time to teach him how to do it. And he always said, he gave me a life, and so he always wanted somebody like that. That's who everybody needs, a net under them, because you can go wild on a page. You can go off in tangents, and you can see that his books started was one thing and wind up at something else. But you have to have somebody that's there to say, you know what, it's not so bad. Because if the 1955 wound up being a drinking life, it certainly wasn't a failure.
It's a good trade, man.
Yeah. No, it's
I'm wondering, Denis, what was it about your formative years that made so many of the Hamills such great storytellers?
They were Irish.
Yeah, that was part of it. It was my mother more than anything. My dad told great stories, but he had an 8th grade education. He was a great singer. He knew a million songs, and he was a raconteur. But my mom encouraged reading. She, Pete's line was that she taught us all that the road out of poverty was through the Brooklyn Public Library. And she was right. And so that the branch on 6th Avenue and 9th Street, where we all went, every one of us, because she had no money, she would get us a library card when we turned the age of 5. And that was like, you could take out 2 books and she had to read them. And then she was a cashier for the RKO Prospect, a half a block away. And we got to see all the movies for free. So we got all the books we wanted for free and all the movies we wanted for free. And Pete's line was, the books made us think. and the movies let us dream. And there's a bunch of us that wrote books and worked in the movie business, including Pete. So and my mom was in the movie business. She sold tickets at the RKO Prospect, and Pete's first job in newspapers was delivering the Brooklyn Eagle. So, he never forgot that, because he met the people who read the paper, and he knew who the audience was. So
I want to pick up on this thread of his generosity, because one of the things that the collection has is dozens and dozens of letters that he got from people who read his books, and dozens of his responses. He customized and responded, and kept them. And just, I'm going to share my screen again for a moment to give you just one example of this. Let's see if that works. Okay, so this is Mrs. Colby Homer, and Mrs. Colby Homer writes to him about Forever. She says, "Dear Mr. Hamill, I have just finished your book Forever. I am an avid reader, and I read between 8 and 10 books a month.
Wow.
At age 48, that amounts to a few, and I have never felt the need to contact the author before until now." And then skipping a couple of paragraphs, she says, "I also must tell you that it has been many years since I read passages that were so well written and thought-provoking that I instantly read the passage again, just for the enjoyment and appreciation for the intellect displayed in such concise space. I actually wrote down a quote or two just for posterity and placed it in a desk drawer." To which he responds, "Dear Mrs. Homer, thank you very much for that wonderful letter, and please excuse this late reply. I've been holed up in Mexico writing a new book and came home to New York for a brief visit and found your letter. As the blizzard hit my street, you warmed my day. Meanwhile, I hope you keep finding books that make you want to copy down some passages." I love that.
Yeah.
Put them in the drawers. So, there's just, there was an enormous indication, in again, the collection of just his attentiveness and generosity and ability to listen and, and care about everybody that reached out to him.
he did it to a lot of people. I mean, I have to tell you, the person I worked for at Law and Order SVU is a guy named Warren Light, who won a Tony on Broadway for a show that he wrote called Sideman. He said when he was a young, struggling journalist, he wrote Pete a letter and got a nice letter in response. He would send it back. Bill O'Reilly, of all people, told me the same thing, that when he was trying to learn how to write, when he was in Harvard, he sent Pete a letter, and he said he sent letters to lots of people, and the only one he heard back from was Pete Hamill. And Pete was like that. Young people always come to me and tell me that your brother always encouraged me, wrote me letters, and answered my letters and gave me encouragement. I just, TJ English once said to me, it was a really fine writer, said to me, "I hope you don't mind that I and so many of us guys borrow Pete as our brother." That's perfectly all right, man. It's perfectly all right. Don't do it, because I'll always have him. But I understand. He was a good guy.
I saw him behave that way in any number of occasions, walking down the street with him, chatting or whatever. Somebody would come up. He would absolutely have to stop him I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened. Somebody would absolutely stop him there and start going on and on and on and on. And, I'm doing this, looking at my watch and going, Pete would go on and just listen and listen, even they're half crazed. And then at the end of it, at a certain point, he had this totally graceful way of ending the moment, ending the conversation, so that the guy didn't feel like this stuffed shirt blew me off or whatever. and it was totally instinctive, instinctual. He just really knew and felt that way about people.
He always thought that good manners didn't cost you 5 cents.
Well, that's a nice line too.
Mhm.
But it was the finesse
Yeah.
that struck me so much.
So we have a bunch of questions, and I think maybe we want to go to take a couple. And one of them, I know people are curious about. It's about the impact of 9/11 on the structure and direction of Forever, and that is an incredible story. Maybe one of you wants to relate.
Well, I think, Bill, you would be best.
Yeah, I can tell you that story. I was sort of refreshing my mind on it. In fact, he had totally finished a draft of the book. Actually, it was his second draft of the book that he had finished, in which, as I mentioned earlier, it had started out as a first-person book from Cormac's point of view in the present, and then with flashing back to the past. And the structural change is what really gave life to the book, because in the first version, it was just sort of, wan and tired and stuff like our 240-year-old man. But so he had finished a draft that was third person, that had started in Ireland and went straight through chronologically to the present day. And then he and Fukiko, his lovely wife, were out, as I'm sure you know, Dennis,
Yeah.
and was right there when everything happened and the buildings collapsed, and they were separated, and it was a terrifying experience for me. And so he wrote me a letter all about the experience, or by then email, and then he said, and I agree completely, he just had to do this as the ending. He had to redo it. And so, we took the book off the schedule it was on, and he rewrote it. And I think his whole account of that, right through the end, it's both the magical realism stuff with the horse and all this sort of stuff, as well as this incredible description of 9/11. It's just some of the best of his prose, period, anywhere. And I was just rereading it, and it brought tears to my eyes again. Yeah. But that's how it happened, Marcy. It's just it was. It had to be readapted for what amounted to a third draft, at least of the drafts that I saw, and that became the final book.
He had an uncanny knack for being where history happened. He was there when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. He was in the room. One of the guys that tackled Sirhan. He was at the Berlin Wall when it came down, and took a sledgehammer and took a whack at the wall himself and wrote about it. And he wrote a first-person piece for the Daily News about 9/11, being trapped and separated from his wife in the middle of the unbelievable dust storm after the collapse of the tower. And so all of that worked its way into, again, the journalism transforming into fiction, and then the magical realism blended in. It's just and that's all his stuff. He grew up as a comic book kid that was in love with comic books and adventure tales, Bomba the Jungle Boy and Steve Canyon and Terry and the Pirates, and all the stuff that affected him as a kid. And his hand lettering on all his notes that comes from him wanting to be a cartoonist when he was young. And so his lettering is like a cartoonist's lettering, and that's the way he took notes. I used to get beautiful letters from Pete, from all the places he traveled around the world. They were handwritten a lot of times. Gorgeous.
I think it can't be said too strongly that comics, the newspaper comics, were a major influence, because when you look at his stories, they are adventure tales, at least the ones that I worked on, and maybe not so much the one about the Dr. North River, but still, it was the influence of comics and the influence of magic realism, I think, were the most Garcia Marquez et al. Were the most pronounced influences on his style and on his outlook.
Yeah, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And also, he studied art in college. He went into the Navy after he dropped out of Regis High School, went into the Navy. And when he came out, the GI Bill changed his life, and he never forgot that. And he went to University of the Americas called Mexico City College then, in Mexico City, learned Spanish, and had the whole adventure of Mexico, in it, which followed him through life, and then realized that he wanted to be a writer more than he wanted to be an artist, but he never stopped. When he would write novels, he would have sketch pads and draw the characters. He would have draw an image of what some of the characters in the book looked like. So he would have a reference. He left it up to the readers to have enough imagination to envision them themselves. But the cartoonist in him had to see them. And so he would have these kinds of, and he would do storyboards that were like cartoon panels. He didn't plot books out in complete detail, as you know. He didn't have a detailed outline, because he thought that if you were surprised as you wrote it, so would be the reader. And he was right about that. But I saw him writing his first novel, Killing for Christ, when I lived with him in Dublin. He went to Dublin to write a novel about the Vatican and about an assassination of the Pope. But he learned how to write it and read books on how to write a novel, one by John Brain called Writing a Novel. And he read all the Paris Paris Review interviews with, George Plimpton did and stuff, and was fixated with George Simenon and a lot of the thriller writers. He loved John D. McDonald a whole lot, Raymond Chandler, Ross McDonald, he loved, Robert B. Parker, all the guys that, and then, other people that wrote the Van der Valk novels in Scandinavia. He just read books from all over the world, and a lot of the thrillers, because that's what he was writing for the first novel. And he just sat down and banged it out. And, but he learned the craft on his own. I watched him do it. I was a kid, but it made it look possible to me. That's what it demystified it for me.
Did either of you ever watch him experience writer's block?
After Robert Kennedy was assassinated, he went into a deep funk, because Pete had written Bobby Kennedy when we were in Dublin, when he was writing A Killing for Christ. He wrote Bobby Kennedy. We had a brother, John, who was in Vietnam. And during the Tet Offensive in the 173rd Airborne, somewhere up in the Central Highlands, we couldn't get any news at all in Ireland about what was going on in the war. And he wrote Bobby Kennedy a note telling him why he thought he should run for president. And then he got a telegram a few days later from Kennedy saying, "I need your help, come back. I'm going to run." And so Pete went back to work on the Kennedy campaign, and he thought it was one of the biggest mistakes of his journalistic life was to get too close to a politician. And he talks about that in a lot of his interviews. But he was traveling with him, and then saw him get murdered in front of him. And he went into a deep funk. My brother Brian was in the room too when that happened, and Brian was taking photographs. And so Pete went into a total funk and didn't write at all for a while. He wrote a quick piece about the assassination, and then he went into a writer's block. And it was Paul Dwyer, the New York politician, that said to him, "You're not important enough to have writer's block. Get back to work, for Christ's sake." He said and that's exactly what he did. It didn't last long. When you're in journalism business, you're not allowed to have writer's block. I mean, I wrote a column for 40 years. If I went and told my editor, "I have writer's block," "Oh yeah, goodbye." I mean, see at the unemployment line. So it didn't.
I remember one instance where he got blocked, and it was all my fault. He was working on Tabloid City, and he showed me some material, preliminary early draft stuff, we thought. And I don't know why, but I came down on it too hard. at that particular moment. It was rough material, but it was at a kind of fragile moment when he was working on the book, and it was all my fault. And he couldn't, for a long time, not a relatively long time, get back on the case on that book. And then he did, and he bounced back, and in fact, wrote a lot better book, but no thanks to me in that instance.
There's a few questions about the book he was working on. Maybe it's Belfast that wasn't published, or maybe it's something someone says from Julie F. says a novel called Old Country. His last book, Maria asks, will these be published? Is there? Do you know whether there's any talk about publishing some?
His last book he was writing was about Brooklyn.
Yes.
It was nonfiction. Yeah.
Nonfiction, yeah.
He did have a novel that he was working on that we contracted for, Little Brown. I had retired, but I was still hired as his editor. And it was about an old mafia don.
Right.
You remember that, Denis?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
And the mafia don goes back to Sicily and stuff. And
Pete went to Sicily to research it.
I know.
Got very sick
I
there.
got great stories out of him about that. But I frankly think wisely decided it just wasn't going anywhere. And he sort of set that aside, at least that's what he told me. And that's when he turned to the idea he and Fukiko just moved back to Brooklyn to write about coming back to Brooklyn. So that's what I remember of that kind of a thing.
Right.
So we are really remarkably running out of time, and I sort of want to let Pete have some of the last word and then get some final thoughts from both of you. So let me share my screen again, because I want to share these two treasures that, again, were in the collection. This is on Daily News memorandum paper. Important 4-letter words. Work, hope, love, and above all, free! Exclamation point, exclamation point. I love that. And then this was just sitting there. The cause of divorce is marriage. The cause of death is life.
Yeah. That sounds like a very typical Pete thought to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And he would spin a story out of it. He would spin a story out of it.
He would, but that's the essence of Pete.
Yeah, it is. And when he did, he did for a while, write for the Daily News Sunday section, a series of short stories called The 8 Million that were sort of based on the old Henry stories. It was a pickup from that. So he would write a short story every week about New Yorkers. Sometimes it would be about a rockette, or it would be about a steel worker or a cab driver when they still worked. Made a living anyway, I should say. I mean, but and then some of them, sometimes they were, they would flash back to his childhood in Brooklyn sometimes. And then he did another set of those in Tokyo after he married Fukiko. He did, another book called Tokyo Sketches, which were short stories about average Japanese people in Tokyo. So, he had a propensity to take a simple idea and write a beautiful, small kind of O. Henry-esque story out of it. Didn't always have that O. Henry-esque twist at the end, which was kind of gimmicky, but they would be really soulful and vivid little tales of the city.
Well, it was such a honor to have a chance to get lost in his papers, and such a privilege to talk to both of you about.
Thank you for doing this about my big brother.
Yeah. it was wonderful to hear you reminisce and react to some of
Yeah.
the papers that we have in the collection. And I can't believe that we've actually run out of time.
Yeah.
But I want to tell everybody who's listening that this is recorded and it will be posted on the Center for Brooklyn History YouTube page tomorrow. And I think that there'll be a link that goes up to that, and that, these collections that are part of the Center for Brooklyn History are for everybody. Anybody can come and have the great experience I did going through the Pete Hamill papers or any number of other collections. And in order to do that, we'll put in the chat a link to find out how you visit our collections. But mostly I just want to thank the two of you. You really, you've really brought this the love of this man that you both have of this man to life, and helped interpret a little bit of the papers, that just a small part of the papers that we have. So thank you.
This helps keep them alive. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcia.
Everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. So long, Bill. Thank you.
Take it easy.